The rain had just begun to fall over the quiet valley of Kent when Edith Pembroke met the man who would change her destiny, Charles Ashbourne, the young Marquis whose world was far beyond her reach. Beneath the glass roof of an old greenhouse, two souls collided between roses and secrets, unaware that love was about to defy everything they had been taught to obey. But in a land ruled by class and pride, love can bloom only through sacrifice. And every choice has a price. If you enjoy timeless romances filled with emotion, betrayal and redemption, subscribe now and help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing these unforgettable love stories to life. Kent, England, spring, 1814. The air smelled of wild honeysuckle and morning rain. Dew clung to every leaf, turning the Pembroke garden into a kingdom of shimmering glass. Inside the modest greenhouse, Edith Pembroke moved with a quiet grace that seemed to echo the rhythm of the earth itself. Her gown of pale muslin brushed softly against the wooden floor, its hem dusted with soil from the pot she tended so carefully. Sunlight spilled through the glass panes, painting her skin in shades of gold and ivory. Her father's voice carried from the back of the greenhouse, gentle and hoarse with age. "The new rose cuttings mustn't dry, Edith. The roots are delicate." "I know, father," she answered, her tone warm and sure. "The earth needs patience, just like the heart." She smiled to herself, unaware that those words, spoken so simply, would one day define her destiny. Outside, the sound of hooves approached, steady and commanding. Edith turned toward the open door, shading her eyes against the sunlight. A tall rider in a dark coat dismounted with practiced elegance, his boots crunching against the gravel. He paused, taking in the simplicity of the garden before stepping inside. "Good morning," he said, his voice rich, deep and unfamiliar. "Forgive the intrusion. I was told this was where I might find Mr. Pembroke." Edith straightened, brushing her hands against her apron. "You are most welcome, sir. My father is in the back. May I ask who seeks him?" The man removed his riding gloves, his movements deliberate, almost too composed. "Charles Ashbourne, Marquis of Ashbourne. My mother's rose garden has suffered neglect since the frost, and I was advised to seek your father's expertise." The name fell like a whisper of another world, one of marble halls and carriages, far from their humble greenhouse. Edith's breath caught, though she hid it behind a polite smile. "My father will be honored to assist you, my lord. Please, come in." As she spoke, the Marquis's eyes found hers, and in that instant, something unspoken passed between them. His gaze, a deep shade of blue-grey, lingered for a heartbeat too long, as if he had not expected warmth in so modest a place. Her father greeted him soon after, bowing with modest respect. While they discussed soil composition and root disease, Charles's attention kept drifting, not to the plants, but to the young woman who moved among them with such quiet confidence. Every gesture of Edith's hands, every word spoken with calm clarity, drew him in further. When her father excused himself to fetch a botanical sample, silence filled the space between them, a silence alive with tension. "You tend this garden yourself?" Charles asked, his voice softer now. "Every leaf and thorn," she replied with a faint smile. "It is my father's life's work, but it has become mine too. The plants listen when one speaks kindly to them." He stepped closer, his boots echoing lightly on the wood. "Then your garden must thrive, for I doubt anyone could resist your kindness." Colour rose to her cheeks, though her composure never wavered. "Flowers bloom for sunlight, not for flattery, my lord." He laughed quietly, not the arrogant sound of a nobleman, but something genuine. "Then I must learn from them." Their eyes met once more, and the greenhouse seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind stirred the cherry blossoms, sending pale petals fluttering past the open doorway like snow. When Mr. Pembroke returned, Charles reluctantly turned away, his tone returning to polite formality. "I shall look forward to your assessment, sir. My mother's garden deserves such capable hands." "You shall have it, my lord," replied Mr. Pembroke, though Edith could feel her father's curious glance upon her. As the Marquis left, she watched him mount his horse. His figure, tall and composed against the brightness of the morning, lingered in her sight until he disappeared beyond the hedgerows. The air still carried his presence, warm and unsettling. That night, when the lamps were lit and the house had gone still, Edith sat by the window, her sewing forgotten in her lap. The scent of roses drifted in through the open shutter. She whispered to herself, as though speaking to the stars, "He came for roses, and yet he has left with something of me." And in the valley of Kent, where the orchards swayed beneath the moonlight, the first seed of love had been sown, fragile, forbidden, and destined to grow where no flower should have dared. It had been a week since Charles Ashbourne had last visited the Pembroke garden. Every morning, Edith found herself watching the path from the greenhouse as though her gaze alone could summon him back. The garden, which had once been her father's pride, was now hers to tend with silent devotion, and yet, despite the beauty that surrounded her, her heart seemed to yearn for something more, for someone more. On the 6th morning after his visit, the air was heavy with the scent of jasmine. The sun had not yet reached its peak, but the warmth of the day already touched the earth in golden beams that made the flowers shimmer with life. Edith worked in the greenhouse, her hands carefully tending to the delicate blooms, arranging them with an artist's touch. Each movement was deliberate, as though she were speaking to the plants themselves. Each stroke of her hand a whispered promise, each breath a prayer for the garden's health. The soft sound of approaching hooves brought her heart to a sudden halt. She straightened, heart racing, as if the very earth beneath her had shifted. She stepped carefully toward the door, peering out with barely contained hope. There he was, Charles Ashbourne. This time he did not come with the usual politeness of a visitor. His eyes, dark and intense, searched the garden as though he were seeking something he had lost. His posture was straighter, his jaw more set, as though something had changed within him since their last meeting. He dismounted quickly, with a swift grace that seemed to belie the weight of his thoughts. "Good morning," he said, his voice warmer this time, softer, almost hesitant. Edith could hardly breathe. "My lord," she managed, trying to disguise the flutter in her chest, but her voice trembled ever so slightly, betraying her. "Please call me Charles." He smiled gently, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her pulse quicken. He stood before her, almost too close, and she felt the tension between them like a living thing. "Charles," she echoed, and the way his name passed her lips made her feel as though it had always been meant to be there. "I've come to ask about the roses," he continued, glancing down at the flower beds around them. His hand twitched, almost as if he were about to reach out and touch a bloom, but he stopped himself. The moment hung in the air, delicate and fragile. "Your father's roses were once magnificent, but now—" His voice trailed off, but the weight of his words lingered. "They will be magnificent again," Edith replied softly, her eyes meeting his. She wanted to say more, wanted to explain that she was the one who could restore them, but something held her back. Her heart ached with the desire to show him the garden she had nurtured with her own hands, but even more, she wanted him to see her. Charles seemed to notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze softening. The air around them felt charged, as though the world had faded away and there was nothing left but the two of them standing in the heart of this living, breathing garden. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost reverent. Edith blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "It's not much," she replied, looking away, feeling suddenly shy under his gaze. She knelt to adjust the position of a delicate rosebush, anything to break the intensity of the moment. "I think it's more than not much," he said, his voice low, and Edith looked up to find him watching her closely. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. He stepped closer, and the air between them grew heavy with the kind of silence that always comes before something significant, something life-changing. Edith felt the warmth of his presence near her, the scent of his cologne mixing with the earthy perfume of the garden. It made her dizzy, as though everything around her had slowed down, leaving only the two of them in this fleeting moment. "May I?" he asked, his eyes flicking to the rosebush she had been tending. Edith nodded without speaking, and he reached forward, his fingers brushing against the delicate petals with a care that made her heart flutter. The touch was brief, but it felt intimate, as though he were marking something sacred, something belonging only to them. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. They bloom only when the right care is given. He looked at her, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. "I'm learning that." The words hung in the air, and Edith felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, her heart beating erratically. She wanted to say something, to ask what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear the truth, whatever it might be. Instead, they stood there in the garden, the silence between them speaking volumes. The roses seemed to bloom in that silence, the petals unfolding as though they too were waiting for something. Charles finally broke the quiet. "I don't wish to burden you, Edith," he began, his tone more serious now, though still laced with a quiet tenderness. "But I feel there is something here, something between us, and I do not know how to navigate it." Edith's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he meant, though she had never expected him to speak it aloud. She took a step back, unsure of what to say. "I don't want to lead you astray," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Our worlds, they are not the same." "They never were," he agreed, his voice low. "But that doesn't mean we cannot find a way, Edith. I've been wrong before, but I'm not sure I want to be wrong this time." The words were raw, vulnerable, and they struck her heart like a blow. He was offering her something real, something that transcended their difference in station. But the fear of what might come if she accepted it held her back. Charles seemed to sense her hesitation, his eyes darkening with understanding. "I do not ask you to promise anything, Edith," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I ask you to consider this. I cannot forget the way I feel when I am near you. You are unlike anyone I've ever known." Edith looked at him then, really looked at him, not as the Marquis of Ashbourne, not as the man who had broken her heart in the past, but as Charles, the man who had shown her kindness in a world that had so often denied it. There was something in him that spoke to her soul, something that she could not ignore. "I don't know what I want," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that I cannot walk away from what you've said. Not yet." Charles nodded slowly, a look of quiet relief crossing his face. "Then we will take this one step at a time," he said, his tone gentle. "I will not press you, Edith, but I will remain here, in this garden, for as long as you will have me." And in that moment, as the sun cast its golden light over the garden, something between them shifted. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was a beginning filled with hope, with uncertainty, and with the kind of quiet passion that could only bloom in the heart of a garden. As the day drew to a close, Charles stood to leave, his gaze lingering on Edith one final time. "I will return soon," he said, "and next time I'll bring something more than words." Edith nodded, her heart still pounding, her mind a whirl of emotions. As he mounted his horse and rode away, she stood at the door of the greenhouse, watching him disappear into the distance. And for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something deep within her chest. Something that, just like the roses she tended so carefully, was beginning to bloom. The spring in Kent had reached its most dazzling moment. The orchards glowed with soft pink petals that floated like whispers through the air, and the sun painted the hills in shades of gold and green. Every path, every stone wall seemed to breathe life. And within this living picture, Ashbourne Hall prepared for its grandest celebration of the season, the Cherry Blossom Feast, an annual event where the nobility of the county gathered beneath the flowering trees to welcome the height of spring. For Edith Pembroke, it was a world far beyond her reach. Her days were spent in her father's modest cottage, arranging flowers and cataloguing specimens with gentle precision. The invitation that arrived 2 days before the feast felt like an impossible dream. The envelope was cream-coloured, sealed with the Ashbourne crest, a silver hawk surrounded by roses. Her father opened it with careful fingers, his eyes narrowing with surprise. "Lord Ashbourne requests our attendance," he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. "A celebration of the cherry blossoms." Edith's heart skipped. "Our attendance?" she asked, unable to hide the disbelief in her tone. Her father nodded. "It seems his lordship wishes to thank us for our work, restoring the roses. It would be impolite to refuse." Her fingers brushed over the embossed paper. She could almost feel the warmth of Charles's hand in the words, even though his name was nowhere written. That night, she stood before the small mirror in her room, holding the only gown suitable for such an occasion. Pale blue muslin trimmed with soft white lace, modest yet graceful. The reflection staring back at her was both familiar and strange. Her hair, chestnut and shining in the lamplight, fell in loose curls around her neck, and her eyes seemed brighter than she remembered. She tied a simple ribbon around her waist and took a steady breath. "It is only gratitude," she told herself softly. "Only gratitude, and nothing more." But her heart refused to believe it. On the day of the feast, Ashbourne Hall was transformed into a vision of elegance. Lanterns hung from the cherry trees, their glass glinting in the sunlight. Long tables stretched across the lawns, covered with white linen, crystal glasses, and silver trays filled with sugared fruits and lemon tarts. The air hummed with laughter, music, and the faint perfume of hundreds of blossoms. When Edith and her father arrived, a murmur ran through the crowd. Their presence was unexpected. Farmers, merchants, and scholars did not often stand beside the county's most distinguished names. But Charles Ashbourne stepped forward from among the guests, his expression warm, his gaze fixed entirely on her. "Miss Pembroke," he said, bowing slightly, "I feared you might not come." "You left us little choice, my lord," she replied, smiling despite the flutter in her chest. He studied her quietly, his eyes tracing the delicate curve of her face, the poise in her posture. "I see I was right to insist," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Their hands met briefly, a polite gesture for the eyes of others, but the moment their fingers touched, the world seemed to pause. She felt the strength of his hand, the gentleness beneath it, and for a heartbeat, she could not breathe. Throughout the afternoon, Charles remained near her. He introduced her father to a few gentlemen of scholarly interest, ensuring he was never left unattended. But his attention always drifted back to Edith, drawn by something neither reason nor decorum could suppress. They walked together through the rows of cherry trees, their branches heavy with blossoms. The petals fell softly around them, gathering in her hair like snow. "You have made Ashbourne bloom again," he said, his tone sincere. "The roses, the gardens, even the air feels different since you've been near." Edith lowered her gaze, her cheeks warming. "I only followed the rhythms nature offered, my lord. I did not do more than any gardener could." "Then every gardener in Kent should envy your touch," he replied. And though his words were light, there was something deeper beneath them, admiration, perhaps even longing. She turned to him, the sunlight filtering through the trees, casting a halo around her. "You speak as though you believe flowers bloom for people, not for the sun." "Perhaps they do," he said softly. "Perhaps some bloom for the hands that tend them, and the heart that believes in them." Her breath caught. His eyes met hers, and the world vanished. The wind stilled, the music faded, and all that remained was the steady, unspoken rhythm between their hearts. Then a sharp voice cut through the air. "Charles!" Lady Agatha Ashbourne stood a few steps away, her presence commanding and cold. Her gown of deep violet silk gleamed like shadow in the daylight, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp with disapproval. "Mother," Charles greeted her, straightening, though his jaw tightened. "I see you found amusement among the blossoms," she said, her tone smooth but laced with quiet disdain. Her gaze slid toward Edith, assessing, weighing, dismissing. "And Miss Pembroke, is it? The botanist's daughter who has revived our gardens. Quite industrious." Edith curtsied politely. "My lady, it is a pleasure to see the roses flourish again. They are the pride of Kent." "Yes," Lady Agatha replied coolly, "and they are meant to remain that way." Her meaning was clear. Charles's eyes darkened, but he held his composure. "Miss Pembroke and her father have done remarkable work, Mother. Their presence today is both deserved and requested by me." The lady smiled thinly. "Then I must trust your judgment, though I hope you remember your duties extend beyond the soil." With that, she turned and drifted away, her silken skirts whispering against the grass. Edith stood in silence, her composure unbroken, though her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "I am sorry," Charles said, his voice low, his expression filled with regret. "My mother's words need no apology." Edith interrupted gently. "She is protecting what she loves, as any mother would." He looked at her with admiration. "Even when you are wounded, you find grace in the moment." She smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is the only way to endure, my lord." For a while, they stood beneath the cherry trees, their silence speaking more than words. Around them, the laughter and music continued, a cruel reminder that they belonged to different worlds, one gilded, one grounded in earth. As the sun began to set, the lanterns were lit, scattering soft golden light across the orchard. The feast turned to dance, the strains of violins drifting through the evening. Charles offered his hand. "Dance with me," he said simply. Her heart trembled, but she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, steady and sure. They moved together beneath the lanterns, their steps slow and measured, their eyes locked as though nothing beyond the orchard existed. "You should not look at me like that," she whispered. "How should I look at you then?" he asked, his voice husky. "As a friend, as a gardener's daughter, as someone you will forget when morning comes." He stopped their movement, holding her hand a little tighter. "Forget you? Edith, even if I wished to, I could not." Her eyes glistened in the soft glow of the lanterns. "Then we are both lost." The music swelled around them, and for a moment they surrendered, two hearts bound by something neither of them dared to name. His hand brushed her waist lightly, guiding her through the dance, and she felt every beat of his pulse as if it were her own. When the final note faded, they stood motionless, breathless, and far too close. He leaned slightly toward her, his voice a whisper. "Tell me this, Edith. If the world were not so cruel, would you let me love you?" Her answer came like the faint rustle of petals. "If the world were kind, I already would." Their eyes met once more, and though no kiss followed, the air between them burned with everything left unsaid. Before the night ended, Charles escorted Edith and her father to their carriage. Lady Agatha watched from a distance, her expression unreadable, but her intentions clear. As the carriage rolled away, Edith looked back through the window. The lanterns flickered behind her, and she saw Charles still standing beneath the trees, his face shadowed with longing. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the weight of what had passed. Beneath the cherry blossoms, a love had blossomed, fragile, dangerous, and utterly impossible, and though she did not know what awaited her beyond that night, she carried with her the scent of the blossoms and the memory of his hand holding hers beneath the falling petals, a memory that would not fade with the dawn. The rain had been falling since dawn, a slow, unrelenting rhythm that blurred the world into shades of grey and silver. The orchards of Kent, once radiant beneath the spring sun, now bent beneath the weight of water. The petals of the cherry trees clung stubbornly to their branches, though many had already fallen, scattered like tears across the soil. Inside the Pembroke cottage, Edith stood by the window, her gaze lost in the storm. The glass trembled under the wind's breath, and beyond it, the world seemed distant, untouchable. Her father read quietly at the table, though his hands trembled with age, and the lamplight painted his features with a fragile glow. There had been no word from Charles Ashbourne for several days, not since the cherry blossom feast. She told herself it was nothing, that he was simply occupied with his estate, that the world of noble obligations demanded his time. Yet in the quiet of the evening, as the wind howled against the walls, doubt began to coil within her chest. She could still feel the warmth of his hand as they danced, the way his voice had trembled when he whispered her name. She had seen truth in his eyes, or so she had believed. But love, she reminded herself, had never been meant for those born in the shadow of the manor. A sudden knock at the door broke the stillness. Her father rose, surprised, and opened it to reveal a young servant in the Ashbourne livery, drenched from the rain. He bowed quickly, offering a sealed letter. "From the Marquis, sir. It is urgent." Edith's breath caught. The servant bowed again and hurried away, disappearing into the misty fields. Her father examined the envelope, his brows furrowing. The seal was intact, the wax glistening deep red. He handed it to her without a word. She hesitated before breaking it. The paper felt heavy in her hands, as though it carried not words but fate itself. The letter was brief. "Miss Pembroke, I ask that you come to Ashbourne Hall at your earliest convenience. There is a matter of great importance I must discuss with you in person. Please trust that this request is made with the utmost sincerity. Charles Ashbourne." Her heart leapt, then sank. Something in the phrasing felt distant, formal, cold. Gone was the tenderness of the man who had once spoken to her among the flowers. She folded the letter carefully, as though afraid it might shatter. "I should go," she said softly. Her father hesitated. "Edith, my dear, are you certain? This summons may not bring the comfort you hope for." "I must know," she whispered. "Even if it brings pain, I must know." The rain did not relent as she crossed the path to Ashbourne Hall. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, and her shoes sank into the mud, but she walked with steady steps. When the gates appeared through the mist, she felt the weight of every memory pressing against her chest, the garden, the laughter, the promises whispered beneath the cherry blossoms. Inside, the manor glowed with candlelight. Servants hurried through the corridors, their expressions tense, their whispers hurried. Edith's heart beat faster as she was led toward the drawing room. Charles stood by the fireplace when she entered, his back to her. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind him. The flames cast a restless glow upon the walls, and the shadows seemed to shift with every flicker of light. "My lord," she said softly. He turned. His face was pale, his expression composed, too composed. His eyes, once alive with warmth, now held something else entirely: restraint, weariness, and perhaps regret. "Edith," he said, her name barely a whisper, "thank you for coming. I came because your letter sounded urgent." Her voice was calm, but inside her pulse quickened with fear. "It is." He paused, searching for words. "There are matters that cannot be avoided, duties, responsibilities that fall upon my name and title. My mother—" "Your mother," she interrupted quietly, "has made her opinion of me very clear." He flinched, his jaw tightening. "She acts as she believes proper. The Ashbourne estate has suffered for years. Our debts are mounting. The only way to preserve what remains is to—" He stopped. "To what?" she asked, though she already knew. He drew a breath, his voice breaking slightly. "To marry advantageously." The words fell between them like the final toll of a bell. For a long moment the only sound was the fire crackling behind him and the rain striking the windows. Edith stood motionless, her eyes fixed on him, her heart refusing to understand. "I see," she whispered at last. "And the woman chosen for this advantage, is she someone you love?" His silence was answer enough. Edith turned away, her hand trembling against the back of a chair. Then everything, every word, every promise, was a lie. "No," he said sharply, stepping toward her. "Nothing was a lie. What I feel for you—" "What you feel." She faced him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Feelings are not enough, my lord. They wither like petals if not protected, and you have chosen to let them die." He closed his eyes briefly, his voice hoarse. "I have no choice, Edith. My title, my people depend on it. If I could live as an ordinary man, I would choose differently." "Then I pity you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, "because you will live surrounded by luxury and die empty-handed." The pain in his eyes was almost unbearable to witness. He reached for her, his hand trembling, but she stepped back. The distance between them widened like an unspoken chasm. "Please," he murmured, his voice breaking, "do not think I meant to hurt you. You are the best part of me." She swallowed hard, her heart torn between love and fury. "Then let the best part of you die, my lord. I will not share it with another." A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not turn away. The thunder outside echoed through the hall, and for a moment he seemed smaller, no longer the Marquis, but a man crumbling beneath the weight of his own choices. "Goodbye, Charles," she said softly. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. She walked past him, her steps echoing through the vast hall, each one louder than the last. When she reached the door, she turned once more. "Do you remember what you told me beneath the cherry trees?" He met her gaze, silent. "You said flowers bloom for the hands that tend them. You were wrong. They bloom for the sunlight, and I must go where the light still lives." She left before he could answer. Outside, the rain had grown colder, harsher. It soaked through her gown, plastering it to her skin, but she did not care. Her tears mingled with the storm as she walked away from the manor, each step carrying her further from the life she had once dreamed of. By the time she reached the cottage, the world had become a blur of grey and sorrow. Her father waited by the door, his face pale with worry. "What did he say?" he asked. Edith shook her head. "Enough to end what never truly began." He took her hands in his eyes full of quiet understanding. "Then let us leave this place, my dear. The soil here has turned to stone." That night the storm raged on. In the glow of the dying fire, Edith sat beside the window, watching the rain trace paths down the glass. Her heart ached, yet somewhere deep within, a flicker of strength began to stir. A fragile spark of defiance. At Ashbourne Hall, Charles stood alone in the drawing-room, staring at the doorway where she had disappeared. The rain outside beat against the windows like 1,000 unanswered confessions. On the mantel, a single rose from her greenhouse, the last she had given him, lay wilted, its petals scattered across the stone. He reached for it, but the petals slipped through his fingers. And as the storm swallowed the night, both of them, one beneath the roof of a crumbling manor, the other in the quiet of a humble home, felt the same truth. Love, when betrayed, does not die instantly. It lingers, haunting every corner of the soul, like the scent of a rose long after its bloom has fallen. London, 1817. The city pulsed like a living beast, restless, grey, and ceaselessly awake. Smoke curled upward from the chimneys in every direction, and the distant toll of church bells drowned in the clamour of wheels and footsteps. To those who arrived with hope, it promised reinvention. To those who arrived with heartbreak, it demanded endurance. For Edith Pembroke, it had been 2 years since she left Kent behind, yet every morning the sound of the rain on her window still reminded her of that night. The night she had walked away from the man who had stolen her peace. She had carried the ache with her to London, hidden in the folds of her shawl and the lines of her hands, now roughened by work. The small flower stall on a narrow street off Cheapside had become her salvation. Each dawn, she stood among the buckets of lilies, roses, and violets, her breath visible in the cold air, her fingers trembling as she arranged blooms for the passing gentry. At first, Few noticed the young woman with the steady eyes and soft voice selling flowers near the busy corner. But as weeks turned to months, whispers spread. Her bouquets had something rare, not merely beauty, but harmony. Each arrangement told a story, and each carried the faint, unexplainable touch of her heart. One misty morning, while the market still stirred to life, a woman in mourning black approached her stall. She was elegantly dressed, though her eyes carried the weariness of grief. She studied the flowers in silence, then asked, "Who arranged these?" "I did, ma'am," Edith answered, her voice steady, though her breath came short. The woman lifted a small bouquet of white lilacs and deep red roses. "These are not chosen by chance. They speak of love that endures loss," Edith replied softly. "And of courage, to love again despite it." The woman's expression faltered, her eyes filling with sudden emotion. "What is your name?" "Edith Pembroke." "Miss Pembroke," the lady said, composing herself, "I am Beatrice Linton. I have a small shop in Covent Garden. We provide arrangements to certain clients of the theatre and Parliament. Would you consider working with me?" Edith's lips parted, though for a moment no sound came. "You would employ me?" "I would partner with you," Beatrice corrected, her gaze sharp and kind all at once. "A woman with your talent should not wilt in the cold." That single encounter changed everything. Within months, Edith left the damp corner of Cheapside for the gentle light of Beatrice's shop, Linton and Pembroke Botanicals. Together, they turned a modest business into one of quiet prestige, known for creating floral masterpieces for society's most celebrated events. The work consumed her days and numbed her nights. The scent of flowers no longer belonged to the countryside of Kent, but to the marble salons of London, where perfumed air mingled with whispers of wealth and scandal. And yet, even as success bloomed around her, Edith never forgot the scent of the roses from her father's garden, or the voice that had once said her name as if it were a prayer. She often dreamed of him, Charles, always standing at the edge of a garden, just beyond reach. She would wake with her heart aching, her pillow damp with tears she never allowed herself to shed in daylight. Beatrice noticed. One evening, as twilight draped the city in violet shadows, Beatrice found Edith in the back of the shop, lost in thought. She stood before a half-finished bouquet, her hands still. "You have the look of someone haunted," Beatrice said gently, her voice calm but direct. "There's a story behind those eyes, Miss Pembroke. Perhaps it's time you told it." Edith smiled faintly. "If I told it aloud, I fear it would sound foolish." "Then tell it in silence," Beatrice replied, "but do not let it bury you. Some stories lose their power when spoken. Others grow lighter when shared." Edith hesitated. "He was a man I loved," she said at last, "and he chose his world over mine. I thought leaving would end the pain, but some memories do not fade. They live in every breath." Beatrice studied her for a long moment. "Then build something greater than the memory," she said. "Turn it into your strength. Beauty born of sorrow is the most enduring kind." Those words became a compass. Edith threw herself into her work with renewed purpose. Her creations grew bolder, more intricate. For the Duchess's wedding, she filled the church with pale pink roses and ivy woven in heart-shaped garlands. For the royal ball that summer, she designed floral chandeliers that drew gasps from the crowd. Soon her name appeared in the whispers of the elite, her reputation sealed not as a mere florist, but as the woman who made gardens bloom indoors. Yet, in the quiet hours of night, her loneliness crept back. The city was grand, but it was not kind, and love, once betrayed, does not die. It changes shape, turning into a phantom that lingers in every act of creation. One evening, as rain tapped gently on the shop's windows, Edith sat by the fire, sketching designs for an upcoming commission. The firelight danced across her face, softening her features into the glow of memory. Beatrice entered, a letter in hand. "This came for you," she said, offering the envelope. "No return address." Edith hesitated before opening it. The handwriting, though unfamiliar, carried a certain elegance. "Miss Pembroke, your arrangements at the recent charity gala were nothing short of extraordinary. I am in need of someone with such refined taste for a series of private commissions. Your discretion will, of course, be valued and rewarded. I ask that you visit the address below at your earliest convenience." The address was written clearly: Ashbourne House, London. Her heart stopped. The letters seemed to blur before her eyes. Beatrice noticed her stillness. "You know this name?" "Yes," Edith whispered, "all too well." "Then perhaps fate is offering you a choice," Beatrice said quietly. "You can refuse it, or you can face what still lingers." For the first time in years, Edith did not know what to say. The thought of seeing anything bearing the Ashbourne name filled her with both dread and longing. Yet curiosity, or perhaps unfinished sorrow, tugged at her soul. That night, sleep refused to come. She sat by the window of her small room, watching the fog drift through the streets like silent ghosts. She imagined him, older now, perhaps thinner, perhaps harder. Would he recognize her if they met again? Would he even want to? But she pushed the thought away. Whatever awaited her at Ashbourne House, it was not love. It was business. It was closure. The following morning, she dressed with deliberate simplicity. A gown of dove-grey silk, a small bonnet tied beneath her chin, gloves of soft cotton. Her reflection in the mirror was calm, composed, but beneath the surface her heart beat wildly. When she reached the grand townhouse in Mayfair, a butler greeted her with restrained politeness. "Miss Pembroke," he said, bowing, "you are expected. This way, if you please." The corridor stretched endlessly, lined with portraits of proud ancestors staring down from gilded frames. The air smelled faintly of roses, but not the fresh kind. These were preserved, their beauty trapped behind glass, colourless and eternal. As she entered the drawing-room, she froze. The voice that spoke her name was not from a stranger. "Edith." She turned. There he was, Charles Ashbourne, older, wearier, but unmistakably him. His hair was slightly greyer at the temples, his posture more rigid, his expression carved with the quiet suffering of years. Yet his eyes, those same storm-blue eyes, met hers with a look that broke something deep inside her. She could not speak. He took a step forward, hesitant, as though afraid she might vanish. "I did not know you were in London," he said softly. "When I saw your name, Pembroke Botanicals, I wondered if it could be you." Edith's voice trembled. "You requested my services?" "I requested your presence," he admitted, "though I had no right to." Her throat tightened. "You have many rights, my lord. Titles give men permission for almost everything." He flinched, but there was no anger in him, only remorse. "You're right," he said quietly, "and yet none of them grant me peace." And the silence stretched between them like a taut thread. She could hear the faint ticking of a clock, the whisper of rain against the windows, the echo of her own heartbeat. At last, he spoke again. "I see that you have built a life here, a successful one. You've become everything I once told you you could be." "I became what I had to," she replied. "Pain has its own lessons, my lord." Their eyes met, and the air filled with the same unbearable tension that had once bound them together. It was the tension of what had been lost, and what could never be reclaimed. He stepped closer, his voice breaking into a whisper. "Do you hate me, Edith?" She took a steady breath, her voice quiet but firm. "I tried to, but hate is only love that has forgotten how to bloom." His expression faltered. For a moment, he looked as though he might reach for her, but she turned away, her composure unshaken. "I came here for business, not for the past," she said. "Tell me what you require, my lord, and I will see it done." He nodded slowly, though his eyes lingered on her face with something like despair. "Very well," he said, "but know this. Every rose I have planted since you left has died. Perhaps you were the only one who knew how to keep them alive. She did not answer. Her hands trembled slightly, hidden beneath her gloves. The scent of roses filled the air again, and in that silence, every memory returned, every stolen glance, every promise whispered beneath the trees of Kent. When she left Ashbourne House that afternoon, the city seemed colder. The carriages rolled past, the fog thickened, and her heart, once tempered by time, felt raw again. Yet as she reached the shop, Beatrice was waiting by the door with her usual calm smile. "Well?" she asked. Edith exhaled softly, her voice barely a whisper. "The roses have not died, Beatrice. They have simply been waiting for the rain." And though she did not yet know it, the storm of her heart was only beginning to stir again, quietly, insistently, like spring returning to frozen ground. The morning mist of Kent clung softly to the rolling hills, wrapping every blade of grass in a veil of silver. After years of absence, Edith Pembroke returned to the land that had once held her heart. The coach wheels turned slowly along the familiar path, passing the stone fences, the orchards, and the wild meadows she had once known by scent and by name. Every corner whispered memories, some tender, some too painful to touch. She had not planned to come back. Kent had been a wound carefully hidden beneath the silk and composure of London. Yet when Beatrice Linton suggested expanding their growing enterprise into the countryside, purchasing a neglected estate with rich soil and greenhouse potential, Edith could not ignore the name written on the deed, Ashbourne Hall. Now, as the carriage stopped before the grand iron gates, her heart thudded with a rhythm both foreign and achingly familiar. The gates stood half open, their paint peeling, their crest dulled by rain. Time had not been kind to the manor. The once proud estate of the Ashbournes looked weary, the gardens overgrown, the fountains dry. The air held the quiet melancholy of a place that had forgotten laughter. Edith stepped out slowly, her boots pressing into the damp earth. She wore a travelling gown of deep emerald silk, simple yet elegant, and a bonnet tied with pale ribbons beneath her chin. The soft wind lifted a few strands of her chestnut hair, and for a moment she stood still, letting the air of Kent fill her lungs. It smelled of rain, of soil, of home. Her carriage driver approached cautiously. "Shall I announce your arrival, ma'am?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the ivy-covered walls. "No," she said at last, her voice calm but distant. "Let the house remember me in silence." As she walked up the gravel path toward the door, every step seemed to echo the ghosts of her youth. The laughter in the orchards, the warmth of spring evenings, the soft murmur of a man's voice beneath the cherry blossoms. Inside, the housekeeper met her with surprise. "Miss Pembroke?" the woman asked, blinking as though unsure whether she was speaking to memory or to flesh. "Yes," Edith said gently. "I come on behalf of Pembroke Botanicals. I believe the estate is under our new lease." The housekeeper nodded awkwardly. "Aye, ma'am, the Marquis. He's here still. Keeps mostly to his study these days." Edith's heart faltered. "He's here?" "Yes, ma'am. Lord Ashbourne returned 2 months past. Things haven't been easy since—" She hesitated, lowering her eyes. "Well, since his wife passed away last winter." A stillness fell over Edith. She did not speak. She could not. The years between them seemed to crumble all at once, leaving only the raw ache of remembrance. She thanked the woman quietly and asked to see the gardens. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The gardens stretched before her, a portrait of ruin and memory. The fountains had cracked, the once perfect paths were tangled with weeds, and the rose bushes she had tended so long ago stood barren and grey. The world she had loved, the place where her heart had first awakened, had withered just as she had once done. And yet, beneath the decay, something stirred. The soil was rich, the roots deep. Life, she thought, could always be coaxed back to bloom. She knelt beside a wilted rose bush, brushing her gloved fingers over the thorns. Her voice was a whisper. "You've been waiting, haven't you? Just waiting for someone to believe you could live again." A soft voice behind her answered, I thought I was dreaming. Her breath caught. She turned. There he stood, Charles Ashbourne. Time had changed him, not cruelly but inevitably. His hair, once golden brown, now held faint streaks of silver. The proud posture of the Marquis remained, but there was weariness in the slope of his shoulders, in the quiet behind his eyes. Yet when he looked at her, the years between them vanished, and he was once again the man who had whispered love beneath a storm of petals. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air trembled between them, filled with things unspoken. "It is you," he said finally, his voice low, roughened by disbelief. "I thought perhaps it was a rumor, that I had imagined it, but it's truly you." Edith rose slowly, her composure intact, though her heart fluttered wildly. "I came on business, my lord," she said, steady but gentle. "The estate has been leased to Pembroke Botanicals for renewal and cultivation." He gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Business," he repeated as if testing the word. "After all these years, it would be business that brings you back." She lifted her chin. "It is the only reason that would make sense." "And yet," he said, taking a small step closer, "it feels like something far less rational." His voice carried a gravity that drew her in despite herself. She could feel the warmth of his nearness, the old familiarity of his presence pressing against the walls she had built. "Please, my lord," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "let us speak plainly. The past is no longer ours." He studied her face, his gaze tracing every line, every shadow. "Do you believe that?" "Yes," she said, but the word trembled, betraying her. He smiled faintly, almost sadly. "You always were a poor liar." Her lips parted, but no answer came. The air between them thickened, as though the very earth held its breath. The sound of the rain softened, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves. "You've changed," he said at last. "You're not the girl I remember." "I could not afford to remain her," she replied. "Life demanded something stronger." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her. "And have you found what you sought?" "I found peace," she said, though even she was not sure if it was true. He stepped closer, his tone gentle. "Peace, perhaps, but not happiness." The words struck something deep within her. "You presume much," she said softly. "I only recognize what I feel," he said, "because it mirrors my own." Silence fell once more. The wind carried the faint scent of roses, the ghost of a memory neither could escape. At last, Edith turned away, her composure returning. "If we are to work together, my lord, I suggest we do so with civility. I will oversee the restoration of the gardens. You may direct your steward to correspond with me through business channels." He exhaled, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "So this is how we shall begin again, as strangers disguised as partners." "We do not begin again," she said, walking toward the fountain. "We continue separately. That is all." But even as she spoke the words, her hand brushed against the stone rim of the fountain, the same place where he had once placed a single rose in her palm, and she felt the trembling echo of that long-ago gesture. Charles followed her gaze to the fountain. "Do you remember the water lilies that grew here?" he asked softly. "I remember everything," she admitted, turning to face him. "And that is precisely why I must forget." He took another step forward, closing the distance between them to a breath. "Tell me how," he murmured. Her voice wavered. "By not asking me to remember." For a heartbeat, they stood so close that she could feel the faint warmth of his breath, the tension that crackled like lightning in the air. His eyes searched hers, not demanding forgiveness but yearning for recognition. Then she stepped back, breaking the spell. "Good day, my lord." He bowed slightly, though the gesture was tinged with sorrow. "Welcome home, Miss Pembroke." As she walked away toward the carriage, she did not look back, but her pulse betrayed her calm. The sound of his voice lingered, deep and steady, echoing through the corridors of her memory. Later that evening, in the quiet of her rented cottage near the estate, Edith removed her gloves and sat by the window. The rain had stopped, and the clouds drifted apart, revealing a thin crescent moon. The scent of the earth after the storm filled the air, rich and full of promise. She opened her notebook, the one she used for botanical sketches, but instead of drawing, she found herself writing words without meaning to. The soil remembers even when the gardener has gone. Roots run deep, they do not forget. Her hand paused. She stared at the ink-stained page, at the quiet confession she had not spoken aloud. Outside, the wind carried faint music from the manor, a piano, distant and mournful. She closed her eyes and listened. She knew that melody. It was the same he had played once, long ago, when the first blossoms of spring had filled the air. And as the night deepened, she sat in silence, her heart torn between the woman she had become and the girl who still waited, somewhere, hidden among the roses of Kent, for love to bloom again. The early summer sun broke gently over Kent, spilling gold across the sleeping fields and filtering through the windows of the old glass house at Ashbourne Hall. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts of time gone by, illuminated by the morning light. Inside, rows of forgotten plants stood in silence, their leaves curled and pale, roots starved of care. The air smelled of damp soil, of memory, of things that once bloomed and were lost. Edith Pembroke stood at the threshold, gloved hands resting against the iron frame of the door. She had arrived at dawn, before the household stirred, before the courage she had found the night before could falter. This place had been her sanctuary once, the heart of everything she had loved and lost. Now it was a ruin, beautiful in its decay, much like the man who still haunted these walls. The sound of boots on gravel reached her, steady and slow. She did not need to turn to know who it was. "Good morning," came Charles Ashbourne's voice, deeper, quieter than she remembered, but still carrying that note of warmth she could never quite forget. She drew in a breath before speaking. "You rise early, my lord." "So do ghosts," he replied gently, stepping closer. "And I am both, a restless soul who walks where he no longer belongs." She turned to face him then. He was dressed plainly, for once, a dark waistcoat without his usual finery, his sleeves rolled slightly, as if he had abandoned the formality that once separated them. The years had left their trace on him, but they had also softened something in his face, replacing pride with gravity. "You still have a way with words," she said softly, "though I wonder if that skill ever served you well." He smiled faintly, his eyes lingering on her face. "Not often, especially not with you." For a moment, silence filled the space between them, a silence heavy with remembrance. The morning light warmed the glass panes, casting reflections of gold over the floor. Edith removed her gloves and knelt beside one of the broken pots, brushing her fingertips over the cracked terracotta. "This place was once alive," she murmured. "Your mother's roses, your lilies, the violets we planted together. They're all gone." Charles stepped closer, crouching beside her. "Because I didn't have the heart to tend them," he said. "Every time I stepped inside, I saw you here, laughing, scolding me for watering too much, humming when you thought I wasn't listening." She froze at his words, her fingers tightening around the rim of the pot. "You remember that? How could I forget?" His voice was low, almost reverent. "You brought life into this house, Edith. When you left, it became nothing more than walls and silence." Her chest tightened. She rose abruptly, brushing the dirt from her skirt, desperate to break the weight of his confession. "We are not here to remember, my lord. We are here to rebuild." He rose as well, his gaze steady on her. "Then let me help you." "You owe me nothing," she said quickly. "I owe you everything," he replied, the words almost a plea. "Allow me this. Let me help restore what I destroyed." The sincerity in his tone disarmed her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she gave a quiet nod. "Very well. But understand this. I'm not the same woman who once followed you through these gardens. I do not seek forgiveness or sentiment. And yet," he said softly. "Forgiveness has already taken root between us. Otherwise, you would not be here." She turned away, unwilling to let him see the flush in her cheeks. The morning deepened into sunlight, and they began their work in silence. He fetched tools long unused, and she cleared the shattered pots and overgrown vines. Their movements fell into rhythm, cautious at first, then seamless, as if their hands still remembered how to move together. Hours passed unnoticed. The light shifted from gold to amber, and the air grew warm with the scent of turned earth. Edith paused to wipe her brow, her fingers trembling slightly from fatigue. Charles, watching her, felt something stir inside him. Not desire, but reverence. The quiet ache of seeing Grace return to a place that had long forgotten it. "You haven't changed," he said quietly. She looked up, startled. "I have changed in every way that matters." "Then perhaps I only see what I want to," he admitted. "You, here, among the flowers. It feels as though time itself bends to let me start again." "Time does not bend," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "It only reminds us of what we've lost." He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "And what if what we lost can still be found?" She met his gaze, her pulse quickening. "Do not ask that of me," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because the answer will undo us both." The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It was filled with the scent of roses long dead, with the echo of their shared laughter, with everything neither dared to say. A sudden breeze swept through the glass house, scattering dust and petals across the floor. The sound of the panes trembling overhead seemed almost like a sigh. Charles's hand moved instinctively, steadying a loose beam above her head. His arm brushed against her shoulder, a fleeting touch, but enough to make her breath catch. They both froze, their eyes locking in the narrow space between them. For a moment neither moved. The tension was almost unbearable, a quiet current running through them, fierce and fragile all at once. Edith's voice broke the spell. "We should stop for today," she said, stepping back, her composure returning. "There's much to plan before the new seedlings arrive." He nodded slowly, though his eyes remained on her. "Very well. But before you go—" She turned, waiting. "Tell me something," he said. "When you look at this place, do you still see what it once was?" She hesitated, glancing around at the broken glass, the vines, the faint glimmer of light through the misted windows. "I see what it could be again," she said at last. He smiled faintly. "Then that's enough for me." As she gathered her gloves, he spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You once told me that every flower has a language. What does this glass house say to you now?" Edith paused, her heart beating painfully in her chest. "It says," she whispered, "that some things can be repaired, but never as they were." He looked at her for a long time, and she could see the unspoken longing in his eyes, not for what they had been, but for what they might still become. When she left the glass house, the air outside was heavy with twilight. The sky glowed pale lavender over the orchards, and the scent of rain promised another restless night. Charles remained inside, watching her figure fade into the distance until the shadows swallowed her whole. That evening, Edith sat by the small fire in her cottage, her hands still marked with soil. She stared into the flames, trying to quiet the tremor that lingered within her. The silence pressed around her, thick and intimate, broken only by the whisper of the wind. She closed her eyes, and the image of him returned, the warmth of his gaze, the steadiness of his hands, the soft curve of his smile. It angered her that he could still find her heart so easily after everything. It frightened her that forgiveness had begun to bloom where bitterness once grew. "Foolish," she murmured to herself. "Completely foolish." And yet, when she looked toward the window, she could see the faint outline of Ashbourne Hall across the valley, a solitary light flickering in one of its upper rooms. She imagined him there, perhaps standing by the window as she did now, thinking of her. The thought should have filled her with sorrow. Instead, it filled her with warmth, the dangerous warmth of hope. At Ashbourne Hall, Charles stood alone in the restored glass house. The moonlight filtered through the newly cleaned panes, casting a silvery glow on the floor. He touched one of the rose stems she had pruned that morning, his fingers brushing the tender green. He whispered to the silence, to the air that still carried her scent. "You were always the light in this place, Edith, and somehow you found your way back to it." Outside, the night deepened. The world seemed to hold its breath. In two separate homes, one grand, one humble, two hearts beat to the same quiet rhythm, bound once more by the fragile, impossible hope that something long buried could still be made to grow again. The grey clouds over Kent had gathered like an omen. Dawn came reluctantly, cloaked in silence, the light pale and uncertain as it touched the ivy-covered walls of Ashbourne Hall. The air smelled of wet earth and old sorrow, and the manor seemed to hold its breath, aware that something long buried was about to surface. In the east wing, Edith Pembroke walked quietly through the long corridor, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She had not intended to visit so early, but the letter she had received at dawn had left her no rest. The housekeeper had brought it in trembling hands, a short note, written in an unsteady script. "Miss Pembroke, Lady Agatha wishes to see you. She insists it must be today. She asks for forgiveness, and time is not her ally." Edith had read it twice, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the morning fire. Forgiveness. The word carried a weight she had never learned to hold. Now, as she reached the door to the Dowager's chambers, she hesitated. For years, she had imagined what she would say if ever they met again. The woman who had stolen not just her happiness, but her father's peace, her home, and the very faith she'd once placed in love. And yet, faced with the fragile quiet beyond the door, Edith felt not anger, but an ache she could not name. The maid opened the door for her with a timid nod. "She's awake, miss, though not well." Lady Agatha Ashbourne lay propped against a mound of pillows, her once imposing figure diminished by illness. The proud arch of her brow remained, but her face was pale, her breath shallow. Her silver hair was unbound, falling loosely over her shoulders, and her nightgown of lace and linen looked almost too heavy for her frail frame. When she saw Edith, her lips curved faintly, not into a smile, but into something between relief and resignation. "So you came," she said, her voice rough and uneven. "I wondered if you would." "I received your note," Edith replied, her tone controlled but not unkind. "You said it was urgent." Lady Agatha motioned for her to come closer. "Sit, if you please. I have not the strength for civility. My confessor says a soul unburdened may rest easier. I do not know if mine deserves such rest." Edith took the chair beside the bed, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. The ticking of the clock filled the silence between them, each second drawing them nearer to what must be said. "You were never cruel," Lady Agatha began, her eyes fixed on the fire. "That was my first mistake. I mistook gentleness for weakness." Edith said nothing. "I thought I was protecting my son," the old woman continued, "protecting the name I married into. The estate was drowning in debt. His father left ruin behind, and Charles, he was too proud, too soft-hearted. I feared he would throw away everything for affection." Her voice faltered, and she turned her gaze toward Edith. "You were that affection, the girl from the gardens, the one who smiled at him as though he were just a man, not a title. Do you know what I felt when I saw him look at you? Terror, because for the first time since his birth, I saw him happy." Edith's throat tightened, but her tone remained steady. "And happiness frightened you?" "It did," Lady Agatha whispered. "Because I had never known it myself. I married for convenience, lived for duty, and bore a son I turned into a symbol instead of a human being. You loved him freely, and that made you dangerous." The truth cut through the air like a blade. Edith looked at the woman before her, so frail now, and wondered how much of that cruelty had been fear in disguise. "I did not come here to reopen old wounds, my lady," she said softly. "You asked for me. Say what you must, and I will listen." Lady Agatha's hands trembled as she reached for something on the table beside her bed, a small box of dark wood, worn smooth by age. "There are things I never told anyone, not even Charles." Her fingers struggled with the clasp until Edith leaned forward to help her. Inside lay several letters, yellowed and sealed with wax, long broken. "These," the old woman said, her voice low, "are the letters I sent to your father's benefactor. The man who withdrew his patronage, the one who ruined his reputation. I orchestrated it all." Edith froze. The words struck her like thunder. "You?" she whispered. "You destroyed my father's livelihood?" Lady Agatha's eyes filled with tears, her control faltering. "Yes. I thought if I cut the root the flower would die. I thought you would leave, forget my son, return to whatever simple life you knew. I never imagined it would cost a man his health, his life." Edith's vision blurred. For years she had wondered what had driven her father to despair after they left Kent. Now the truth lay before her, small enough to fit in a box, but vast enough to drown them both. The room was silent, except for the slow crackle of fire. "I hated you then," Lady Agatha murmured, "not for who you were, but for what you made me see, that my son could love beyond ambition, beyond pride. You reminded me of everything I had denied myself." Edith rose, unable to sit still. She crossed to the window, pressing her gloved hands against the cold glass. Outside, the sky had begun to weep, a light, steady rain. "I came here to find peace," she said quietly, "not to unearth ghosts." Lady Agatha's voice was barely a whisper now. "Then give me peace, Miss Pembroke. Tell me that you forgive me." Edith turned, her expression unreadable. "Forgiveness is not a word I give lightly." "I know," the old woman said, her eyes closing for a moment. "But perhaps you understand better than most. Forgiveness is not mercy. It is freedom. I chained my son with my fears. Do not let me chain you with my sins." Edith's chest rose and fell with trembling breaths. She moved closer, looking down at the woman who had been both her enemy and her reflection in age. "You destroyed what I loved most," she said softly. "And yet, what I loved has survived. Not in the way it once was, but in the way the seasons survive winter. They return, slowly, quietly, when the ground is ready." A tear slipped down Lady Agatha's cheek. "Then you forgive me?" Edith hesitated, then reached for her hand. The skin was thin, almost translucent. "I forgive the woman who was afraid," she whispered, "but not the mother who made fear her legacy. You have one last chance to leave him something better." "What would that be?" "Truth," Edith said simply. "Tell him everything. Let him face the past without your lies." Lady Agatha's lips trembled. "And if he hates me for it, then let him finally love honestly," Edith replied. "Even if it is not you he loves." The older woman gave a weak laugh that turned into a cough. "You speak like a poet. I once hated that about you." "Then perhaps," Edith said softly, "we have both changed." When she left the room an hour later, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of damp stone and faded lilacs. In her hand, she carried the wooden box, Lady Agatha's request, a final offering to be given to Charles when the time was right. As she walked down the hall, her reflection caught in a mirror, pale, steady, her expression calm, but her eyes alight with something new. Not anger, not even sorrow. Resolve. She passed the study, its door slightly ajar. Inside, she could hear Charles's voice speaking to a steward about estate matters. That voice still carried warmth, though she could sense the exhaustion beneath it. She lingered at the threshold for a moment, unseen, listening to the cadence of his words. When the steward left, she stepped forward. He looked up, surprised. "Edith." "My lord," she said, her tone even, "I have just come from your mother's chamber." He rose immediately, concern flickering in his eyes. "Is she—" "She is weak," Edith interrupted gently, "but her mind is clear. She spoke to me of past wrongs." He frowned, his expression tense. "She asked you to come?" "She did, and I believe she means to make amends. Charles's shoulders lowered, relief mingled with confusion. Then perhaps there is still time for her to find peace. Yes, Edith said quietly, but the truth will bring her peace, not silence. He studied her face, sensing the gravity behind her words. What did she tell you? Only what I needed to hear, she replied, holding his gaze. The rest, she will tell you herself. He hesitated, then nodded. You've always had a way of speaking that makes me listen. She smiled faintly. Perhaps because I only speak when it matters. Their eyes met, a long, wordless exchange heavy with meaning. The firelight caught his features, softening the edges of his grief, and she felt again that dangerous pull between them. Thank you, he said finally, his voice low, for being kind to her. I was not kind, she murmured. I was honest. Sometimes that is a harder gift. He stepped closer, his expression searching hers. And what of me? Will you ever be honest with me again, Edith? Her heart faltered. Perhaps when honesty no longer hurts. Before he could answer, she turned toward the door, the wooden box still clutched in her hand. Your mother needs you, she said, without looking back. When she was gone, Charles stood alone by the fire, his thoughts spinning like leaves caught in a storm. Outside, the rain began again. Soft, cleansing, relentless. In her chamber, Lady Agatha closed her eyes, her breathing shallow but steady. She whispered to the silence, to the ghost of her own guilt. I have confessed. Now let the garden grow again. And as the house slept, the storm washed the last of the dust from the glass-house panes, letting moonlight fall gently through, fragile, silver, and full of promise. The day had begun with rain, but by afternoon the clouds scattered, leaving behind a golden haze that bathed Kent in the soft glow of late summer. The light touched everything, the old oaks, the distant hills, the still ponds, until even the worn stones of Ashbourne Hall seemed to breathe again. Inside, the servants moved quietly, their footsteps muted, their voices hushed, as though the house itself had grown fragile with the passing days. Edith Pembroke walked through the long corridor that led to the gardens, her heart heavy with the weight of what she carried. In her gloved hands rested the small wooden box, the same one Lady Agatha had given her days before, filled with the letters that held the truth of every wound between her and Charles. She had promised the dying woman she would deliver it, though she had not known then what it would cost her to do so. The sound of her steps echoed softly against the marble floor. The scent of lavender drifted from the open windows, mingling with the faint hum of summer insects. It was the kind of afternoon that once would have brought her peace, yet now it felt like standing on the edge of something vast and uncertain. In the drawing room ahead, she saw him, Charles Ashbourne, standing near the tall windows, sunlight glinting off the polished buttons of his waistcoat. He looked older still, the lines of his face deeper, the calm of his posture almost brittle. But when he turned and saw her, his expression changed, softened, as if her very presence had loosened something long held tight. Edith, he said quietly, I hoped you would come. I promised your mother I would, she replied, her tone even, though her pulse trembled beneath the words. She asked that I give you this. She held out the box. For a moment, he did not move. His eyes lingered on it, as though it were something dangerous or sacred. Slowly he reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took it. That brief touch, no more than a second, was enough to make the air between them shift, alive again with the tension of years unspoken. My mother's box, he murmured. I thought it gone. She wanted you to know the truth, Edith said. All of it. He looked at her then, the question unspoken in his gaze. And do you know what truth it holds? Yes, she answered softly. And I think you should read it. He hesitated before sitting near the hearth. The fire burned low, casting faint light across his face as he opened the box. Inside lay the letters, brittle and time-worn. As he read, the silence grew heavier. With every line, his expression shifted. Disbelief, pain, realization. At last, he set the final letter down, his hand trembling. She ruined your father. I did not know. She told me, Edith said, and I forgave her. He looked up sharply. How could you? Because hatred would have turned me into her, she said simply, and because I wanted to stop carrying what was never mine to bear. Charles's throat worked, his voice unsteady. All this time I blamed myself. I thought my betrayal destroyed you, destroyed him, but she did what she thought she must. Edith interrupted gently, and so did you. He rose suddenly, unable to sit still, his gaze turning toward the window where the light spilled across the floor. I thought I could make peace with the past, but now I see it was never buried. It lived in every silence between us, in every empty season. Edith approached him slowly, her hands clasped before her. Then stop trying to bury it, she said. Let it live and fade on its own, as all things must. He turned toward her, the gold of the sunset reflecting in his eyes. You speak of forgiveness, as though it were simple. It isn't, she said quietly. It's an act of courage. A long silence stretched between them. He took a slow breath, then reached out, his voice trembling slightly. You've always been braver than I. She shook her head. No, my lord. I simply learned that pain cannot be outlived, only understood. He smiled faintly at her choice of words. Still you call me my lord, after all these years. It's habit, she said, though a soft smile ghosted her lips, and perhaps a shield. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room, and she felt the familiar rush of warmth that always came when he was near. Dangerous, inevitable, impossible to deny. Then let me ask you, Miss Pembroke, he said, his tone quiet but intent, if you could begin again, without title, without past, would you still build walls between us? She hesitated. We cannot live without the past. But we can choose what remains of it, he said. For a moment neither moved. The golden light faded to amber, the shadows lengthening around them. Then, without knowing why, Edith whispered, Come with me, to the garden. He followed her outside. The evening air was soft and fragrant, the sky painted with streaks of violet and rose. The restored paths of the garden glistened faintly after the rain, and the glass house ahead shimmered with the reflection of the dying sun. When they reached the fountain, she stopped. The water, newly restored, trickled gently, catching the light like liquid gold. Your mother asked me to plant something here, Edith said. Something that would bloom even in the shade. He looked at her hands, still stained faintly from the soil. You've already begun, she nodded. A rose, of course. He smiled, the first true smile she had seen on his face in years. It suits you. Roses endure. Only if tended, she replied, her voice soft. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on hers. Then perhaps we might tend this one together. The words hung between them, fragile, uncertain, beautiful. She looked away, her breath trembling. Charles, you must not speak as though the past can be rewritten. It cannot. I don't want to rewrite it, he said. I want to understand it. I want to understand you. Her eyes lifted to his, full of light and conflict. You once understood me too well. Then tell me what I've forgotten. The evening deepened, the sky dimming to the color of violets. Fireflies began to rise among the hedges, their glow soft and fleeting. Edith's voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. You forgot that I never wanted a title, or riches, or power. I wanted the man who could stand beside me and see the world not as duty, but as wonder. He closed his eyes briefly. I was that man once. Perhaps, she said, her tone trembling, you could be again. The faint breeze lifted her hair, carrying the scent of roses between them. He reached out slowly, carefully, as if asking permission, and took her hand. His touch was warm, steady, nothing like the fevered grasp of youth, but something deeper, anchored in years of longing and regret. Edith, he whispered, I have lived surrounded by all that wealth can buy, and none of it filled the space you left. I buried myself in work, in silence, in the illusion of pride. But you, his voice faltered, you are the only thing that ever grew from my ruin. Her breath caught, her hand trembling in his. Do not say such things. They're true, he said, and truth is all I have left to give you. Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back. You cannot undo what was done. No, he said, but I can build what should have been. The sky had turned to indigo now, the stars faint but growing brighter. The fountain's soft murmur seemed to echo their words. Edith took a step back, her composure slipping for the first time. If you truly wish to make amends, then let this garden live again. Not for me, for the world. Let it bloom as it once did. He smiled, a quiet, sorrowful smile. And if I say I want it to bloom for you? Her heart stuttered. She looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Then perhaps I would not stop you. The tension between them swelled again, not in anger, but in longing, in the soft ache of something reawakening after years of silence. He lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture both reverent and restrained, pressing the faintest kiss upon her glove. Do you still believe, he asked softly, that flowers bloom only for sunlight? She met his eyes, her voice trembling but clear. No, they bloom for those who dare to care for them, even after the frost. He smiled faintly. Then let me be that care. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words never came. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves filled the silence between them. As the first stars lit the sky, Edith turned toward the fountain, her reflection shimmering on the water's surface beside his. Two figures, side by side, one shaped by forgiveness, the other by redemption. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. The past may be gone, Charles, but the roots remain. He took a slow breath, his gaze steady on her. Then let us see what they can still bear. In the hush of that summer dusk, surrounded by the scent of new roses and the sound of the fountain's eternal song, the walls between them began, at last, to crumble. And in that fragile quiet, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, something long dormant stirred again, as if love itself had chosen to bloom once more. The first light of dawn touched the hills of Kent like a tender promise. Mist still clung to the orchards, wrapping the valley in a veil of silver and gold. From her window, Edith Pembroke watched as the sun began to climb above the horizon, each ray of light painting the world in warmth. The glass panes were cold beneath her fingers, but the air carried that sweet, fragile stillness that only comes after a night of rain, the kind that whispers renewal. It had been 3 days since Lady Agatha's passing. The manor had fallen into mourning, its rooms hushed, its windows dimmed by heavy drapes. Yet outside the world refused to share in its sorrow. The gardens had begun to bloom again, almost defiantly. Roses climbed the trellises with renewed colour. Violets peeked from the grass, and the first lilies opened by the fountain where the water now ran clear. Edith had spent those days tending to the earth, her hands in the soil from dawn until dusk. It had been her way of grieving, not through tears, but through care. The garden, once a symbol of pain, had become her solace once more. Each bloom she touched seemed to whisper, "Life continues." That morning, she dressed simply in grey muslin, her hair pinned loosely beneath a soft bonnet. When she stepped outside, the chill bit gently at her skin, carrying the scent of damp leaves and roses. She followed the path to the glasshouse, where the first rays of sunlight spilled through the clear panes. Inside, Charles Ashbourne stood alone. He was not in mourning black, but in a dark blue coat that suited the depth of his eyes. His posture was still proud, though softened by the weight of recent days. In his hands, he held one of his mother's letters, now folded and worn from too many readings. When he turned and saw her, the tension in his shoulders eased, and for the first time he smiled, faintly, sincerely. "You always appear with the morning," he said quietly. She smiled in return, her voice calm and low. Perhaps the morning knows where I am needed. He moved closer, the paper still clutched between his fingers. I read them all, every letter, every line. And did you find peace in them? She asked. Not peace, he said, but truth. And perhaps that is the beginning of peace. He paused, his gaze drifting to the flowers blooming near the window. She spoke of you often, not by name, never that, but I can see it now, between the words. Her remorse was the only love she knew how to give. Edith lowered her eyes, her hands brushing against the petals of a white rose. Sometimes love arrives too late, but even then it teaches us something. He studied her face for a long moment, the light playing across her features. And what has love taught you, Edith? She looked up, meeting his gaze. That it cannot be demanded, it must grow, like these flowers, with care, with patience, and sometimes through pain. He took a slow step closer. And has it grown again? Her breath caught. I do not know. Yes, you do, he said softly. You felt it too. The air between them thickened, that fragile, familiar pull that neither could escape. The glass house seemed to glow around them, the sunlight refracted through the mist, the scent of earth and bloom heavy in the air. I buried it once, she whispered, because it hurt to feel it. And yet, he murmured, it still found its way back to you. Edith's hands trembled slightly as she traced the edge of a leaf. You speak as though love were inevitable. For us, I believe it always was. Silence settled between them again, the kind that hummed with all that was unsaid. The wind outside brushed softly against the glass, and somewhere a bird began to sing, a single clear note that echoed like a vow. At last, Edith turned toward him fully. Charles, she began, her voice unsteady, your mother's death has left you free of many burdens. The estate will flourish again, and your name will be restored. You owe me nothing. He stepped closer, his voice breaking slightly. You are wrong, I owe you everything. You gave me back my life, the courage to face what I had destroyed. I thought I had lost you forever, Edith, and now that you stand before me again, I cannot pretend it does not matter. Her eyes glistened, though she tried to steady her voice. What you ask of me? I ask nothing, he interrupted gently. I only wish for you to stay, not for the gardens, not for duty, but for yourself, for me. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the truth in his tone. I have built my life upon independence, she said quietly. I have learned to stand alone. And I do not ask you to surrender that strength, he replied. I only ask that you let me stand beside it. His words reached her like warmth after a long winter. Her chest rose and fell, her breath catching as she fought the storm inside her, the fear of trust, the ache of longing, the fragile hope that perhaps this time it might last. Charles, she whispered, her voice trembling, we cannot be who we were. No, he said, stepping closer, his gaze steady, but we can be who we've become, together. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then, almost without thought, her hand lifted, not to push him away, but to rest lightly against his chest. Beneath her palm, she felt the steady rhythm of his heart. He covered her hand with his own, his touch gentle but sure. This is where you have always belonged, he said softly. Not in my manner, not in my title, but here, where I am still a man capable of feeling. Her eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. You make it sound so simple. Love is never simple, he said, but it is real, and I would rather live with its thorns than without its bloom. A tear slipped down her cheek. You and your roses, she murmured. He smiled faintly. They have always been yours. Outside, the sunlight grew stronger, filtering through the glass until it wrapped them both in a soft, golden glow. She felt the warmth against her skin, the pulse beneath her hand, the quiet certainty that something long dormant was awakening once more. Her voice was barely a whisper. If I stay, what will we be? He looked into her eyes, his expression unguarded, raw with sincerity. Two souls that found their way through ruin to something truer. Two hearts that learned how to grow again. The glass house filled with the scent of roses, newly opened, their petals catching the light. For a long moment, they simply stood there. No grand declarations, no promises carved in words. Only the silent understanding that the past had finally loosened its hold. Edith exhaled, her voice trembling as she spoke. Very well then, let the garden decide. He smiled, a quiet, reverent smile that reached his eyes. It already has. She felt his hand slip from hers, only to find it again, fingers intertwining naturally, effortlessly, not as possession, but as recognition. Outside, the fountain murmured softly, its water glimmering beneath the sunlight, reflecting fragments of blue sky. Later that day, as the sun began its slow descent, the village bells tolled from beyond the valley, marking the hour of evening prayer. The sound drifted over the fields, across the orchards, and through the glass house where they stood. Edith leaned against the doorway, watching the light fade into amber. Charles stood beside her, silent, his hand still in hers. The air smelled of rain and roses and something new, something fragile yet unbreakable. "Do you remember," he said after a while, "what you told me once? That flowers bloom for sunlight, not flattery?" She smiled faintly. "I was younger then, too certain of everything. And now?" "Now," she said, looking at the garden, "I believe they bloom for hope, for the chance to begin again." He turned toward her, his expression full of quiet wonder. "Then let us begin." As the last light of day kissed the horizon, they stepped into the garden together. The path glowed beneath their feet, damp and shimmering, leading them toward the fountain, where the roses grew wild and unashamed. She lifted her skirt slightly, laughter, soft, unguarded, escaping her lips for the first time in years. And when he looked at her, really looked, he saw not the girl he had lost, but the woman he had been given another chance to love. The breeze carried the scent of blossoms around them, tender and alive. Above, the sky deepened into shades of violet and gold, and the first stars appeared like scattered petals across the heavens. In that quiet, luminous hour, the garden of Ashbourne Hall bloomed again, not for the past, nor for the ghosts that lingered, but for the two souls who had endured the storm and found each other once more. And as the night embraced them, the world seemed to sigh in contentment, as if even the earth itself had decided to forgive. The Valley of Kent had changed with the passing of years, but its beauty had not dimmed. The hills were greener now, the orchards thicker with fruit, and the air still carried the same sweet scent of wildflowers that once drifted through the open fields. The glass house at Ashbourne Hall stood at the heart of it all, no longer a relic of decay, but a living monument to patience, care, and love reborn. It was a clear summer morning, the kind that makes time itself seem to pause. The light poured gently through the glass, falling upon rows of thriving roses in every shade imaginable. Beneath the archway of climbing vines, Edith Ashbourne walked slowly, her hands brushing the soft petals as she passed. Her dark hair, streaked now with silver, framed a face still serene, still beautiful, the kind of beauty that no longer sought to dazzle, but to comfort. Outside, laughter echoed from the garden, a boy's voice, quick and bright. "Mama! Mama, look! It's the first bloom of the white rose you planted." She turned toward the sound, her eyes warming. Her son, Henry, now 11, stood near the fountain with a rose in his hand, beaming as though he had discovered a treasure. A few paces behind him, his sister Clara, barely 8, watched with the solemn curiosity of a child who already carried her mother's calmness. "Careful, Henry," Edith called softly. "Don't cut too low. Roses forgive little, but not neglect." "Yes, Mama," he replied, grinning before dashing off again. A familiar shadow appeared at the edge of the garden, tall, composed, touched by years yet steady as ever. Charles Ashbourne, now greyer at the temples, paused for a moment to watch the scene unfold. His eyes, still that same clear blue-grey, found her across the sunlight. The smile that curved his lips was small, but full of quiet wonder. "Every year," he said, walking toward her, "you tell him the same thing, and every year he forgets." Edith smiled faintly. "Then perhaps some lessons must be learned through thorns." He chuckled, the sound deeper now, softer with age. "A philosophy you've practiced with me all too well." She lifted a brow in mock reproach. "And yet you survived." "Barely," he said with a teasing glint. They stood together for a moment, their shoulders brushing, both looking out at the garden that had once mirrored their ruin and now reflected their peace. The fountain sang gently beside them, its water clear as glass. Beyond it, the orchard stretched toward the horizon, rebuilt, thriving, full of colour and sound. The years had been kind to Ashbourne Hall, though not without effort. After Lady Agatha's death, Charles had dedicated himself to renewing not only the estate, but the village it governed. Where once the tenants had lived in quiet hardship, now the cottages stood bright with painted shutters, the fields richer, the people prouder. He had used his mother's hidden funds, the same wealth she had once guarded so fiercely, to create a trust for education and fair wages. It was said that in all of Kent, no landlord was more respected than Lord Ashbourne, the man who had learned redemption from love. Edith's business, too, had grown beyond what either she or Beatrice Linton had once imagined. Pembroke Botanicals supplied arrangements not only to London's grandest halls, but also to the smaller, humbler weddings and funerals of nearby towns. Edith never sought prestige, only purpose. Yet her name had become a quiet legend among those who believed beauty could heal what time had broken. From the village road came the distant sound of hooves, a carriage arriving. Beatrice herself stepped down, her once dark hair now silver, her figure still brisk and commanding. She waved at the children before approaching the couple. "Ah, there you are," she said, smiling. "Your roses have become the envy of all of Kent, my dear Edith, and the envy of my suppliers, I might add." Edith laughed softly. "You should take pride in that, Beatrice. You taught me everything I know about making beauty from what the world overlooks." "Nonsense," Beatrice said, her tone fond. "You surpassed me years ago. I'm merely the gardener who kept the weeds at bay while you grew wild." Charles extended a hand to her. "Beatrice, as always, you're welcome here." "And as always," she said with a playful tilt of her head, "I intend to make myself at home." They shared a moment of laughter, the easy kind that comes only from years of companionship and forgiveness. The breeze carried the scent of blooming roses and ripened apples. When Beatrice wandered off to find the children, Charles turned to his wife, his voice quieter. "Do you ever miss London?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "The noise, the chaos, the anonymity. And yet," she smiled, glancing toward the valley, "and yet, here I can hear myself think. Here, the silence isn't loneliness, it's peace." He studied her for a moment, the light softening his expression. "You brought that peace here, Edith. You gave it to me, to this place. Even now, I still wonder how I deserved it." She reached for his hand, her fingers entwining with his. "You didn't have to deserve it," she said gently. "You only had to accept it." For a long moment they stood like that, surrounded by the murmur of life, the rustle of the wind through the ivy, the laughter of their children drifting like music through the garden. Charles's gaze lifted toward the hills. "Do you ever think of her? My mother?" Edith nodded slowly. "Often, but not with anger anymore. I think she finally found what she longed for. Rest. And perhaps, in her way, she gave us this." He looked at her, puzzled. "This garden," she said softly. "Her guilt built it, but our forgiveness made it bloom." The truth of it lingered in the air, tender and profound. As the day wore on, the household gathered for supper in the orchard, a long table beneath the boughs heavy with fruit, the servants, tenants and friends all sharing the meal as one. Children ran between the trees, their laughter mingling with the hum of cicadas. It was not the grandeur of nobility that filled the evening, but the quiet dignity of belonging. When twilight came, lanterns were lit, their glow golden and warm. Edith sat at the head of the table beside her husband, watching as Henry tried to teach Clara how to whistle, failing miserably but laughing all the same. She turned to Charles, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "Do you see them? They will never know the world as we did, divided by pride, shadowed by fear." He nodded. "Because you changed it." She shook her head. "Because we did." The last of the sunlight faded, leaving the sky painted in shades of violet and silver. The stars began to emerge, scattered like seeds across the heavens. Charles took her hand again, lifting it to his lips with a tenderness that had never dimmed. 12 years, he murmured, and still, I find new ways to love you. She smiled, her eyes glistening with quiet emotion. Then love has done what gardens do best. It's learned how to grow, even after the frost. He looked at her, his gaze filled with gratitude and wonder. "You were right," he said softly. "Flowers do bloom for sunlight, but sometimes, Edith, they also bloom for each other." The night deepened. The glass house gleamed in the distance, its windows aglow with lantern light. Within it, the roses stood tall and vibrant, living proof that beauty could rise again from ruin. And as the wind swept gently through the orchard, carrying the scent of blossoms and the sound of laughter, the world around them seemed to sigh, not in sorrow, but in peace. The Marquis who had once betrayed love now lived by its grace. The woman who had once fled heartbreak now ruled her heart with serenity, and in the garden they had rebuilt together, life bloomed endlessly, a testament to the truth they had fought to learn. Love, when tended, outlasts the seasons. It survives the storm, the silence, and even time itself. And so, beneath the Kentish sky, Edith and Charles Ashbourne grew old hand in hand, their love rooted deep in the earth that had once witnessed their fall. And now, their everlasting bloom. There are stories that end quietly, like the fading of a sunset, and others like this one, that linger in the heart long after the last word. The tale of Edith and Charles Ashbourne reminds us that love is not only a matter of passion, but of courage. The courage to forgive, to rebuild, and to believe again when everything once seemed lost. Through betrayal and silence, they learned that the most beautiful gardens are not born of perfection, but of persistence, that the soil of our lives, even when scarred by pain, can still bear something extraordinary if we choose to nurture it with hope. And perhaps that is the truest form of love, not the kind that never falters, but the one that returns, steady and renewed, after the storm. If this story touched you, if at any moment you felt the echo of your own heart in theirs, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, what part of their journey moved you most? And to let me know you stayed until the very end, write the word bloom below. Because like Edith and Charles, every one of us carries within us a seed waiting for the right season to grow again. If you wish to support the team who brings these timeless love stories to life, you can send a super thanks on YouTube with any amount you wish. Every gesture, big or small, helps us keep creating worlds where emotion, beauty, and hope never fade. And if you can't contribute that way, your support still means the world. Simply share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for dreaming with us. Don't forget to explore the other romantic tales waiting for you in the cards, each one written with the same heart, the same tenderness, and the same belief that love, when true, never truly ends. Because sometimes, as this story reminds us, even after the coldest winter, love learns to bloom again.